Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. Well, one can hardly turn on the television, radio, or social media without somebody trying to convince you of something or persuade you to do something. As somebody in the communication business, this interests me. It fascinates me. It scares me. So I reached out to an expert on rhetoric and asked him to come on the show, and he obliged. He's a professor of communication arts at Waterloo University. Professor Robert Danisch, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Michael, and I'm happy to talk about persuasion, one of my most favorite things to talk about and something I find endlessly interesting also.
Well, I kind of already gave it away about what rhetoric is, but It'll probably help if a expert on the subject explains it a little bit. So what is rhetoric?
Sure. I mean, we could think about it as the strategic art of persuasion, but to put it in a slightly bigger basket. So my field is communication studies, and rhetoric is a specific branch of communication studies. So I have colleagues that study all kinds of things: media effects, interpersonal communication, small group communication, deliberation, argumentation, all these sorts of things. And when you think about communication, a mistake people often make is they think communication is the transmission of information from me to you. So I tell you where I'm from, you receive the information, we think communication has happened. Rhetoricians don't think about communication like that. They think of communication as a process of producing effects. So I say something, it affects you. And rhetoric is the attempt to kind of strategically manage those effects, to sort of think about what you're going to say beforehand so that you have the effect that you want. And rhetoricians have long thought that that's the key to persuasion. In some ways, it's the oldest formal field of study in the West. We might get into that. It predates Plato even. So this has been a long-standing fascination for, I think, Western intellectuals at the very least.
Well, you brought us back to before Plato. So who were some of the better rhetoricians throughout history?
Yeah, so if we rewind to ancient Athens, Athenian democracy and the study of rhetoric went hand in hand. And the original teachers of rhetoric were a group of people that we now call the Sophists. And if you read or are familiar with Plato's dialogues, almost every one of the dialogues begins with a sophist as an opponent of Socrates. Protagoras and Gorgias are perhaps the two most famous sophists. And the sophists taught basically public speaking. They taught wealthy Athenian kids who wanted to have a career in public life the art of public speaking for the purposes of persuasion. And Socrates and Plato are obviously like deeply bothered by these folks because they had skill. And the Sophists became wildly wealthy, some of those teachers. They were much more popular than Plato's Academy, much more successful in a certain way, maybe not over the long term. Obviously, like I think Plato won that over the long term, perhaps, but in the moment, they were very successful. And the idea was that you needed to communicate effectively in a democratic system because the best speakers drove policy decisions or collective action in those situations.
You know, you mentioned Athens, and Athens is, of course, famous for democracy.
Yeah.
Is rhetoric more prevalent in societies where the regular people have a say?
Yeah, so this is like a brilliant question, and I don't want to speak for the field on this one because there's some controversy. I'm in a debate about this right now with an editor of a rhetoric collection. I think yes. I think the study of I'll put it like this: the study of rhetoric tends to flourish in democratic societies because of the importance of communication skills in negotiating and driving change or decision-making processes. So at the very least, rhetoric becomes a kind of thriving area of intellectual concern in democratic societies. Now, others will argue that even authoritarian countries, Soviet Russia, like these sorts of places, use rhetoric clearly, but perhaps the emphasis on learning rhetoric or teaching rhetoric to the largest number of citizens might not be as prevalent. I, in my own research, sort of argues that democracy and rhetorical education sort of go hand in hand. They have to go hand in hand. But I don't, like I said, I don't speak for the field on this one.
My thinking when I first asked the question was, of course, in societies where people get to vote and have an influence over policy, rhetoric would be more prevalent. But as I was asking the question, the vision of Hitler came to my mind, and he's up there screaming, and so it's not limited to democracies by any means, correct?
I think that's exactly right. That's why I think I put the focus on education. So if you think about Athens, like what was so clear in Athenian democracy was that students, parents they wanted their kids to be successful. They wanted them to have an education in rhetoric. That's not always as clear to me in authoritarian systems, where perhaps the authoritarian who's using rhetorical devices doesn't so much want all of his or her citizen, I guess almost always his citizens understanding or participating in kind of rhetorical education, but they are certainly using those rhetorical devices to control populations or create kind of commitment and belief.
In our own history in the United States, one of the more famous orators or rhetoricians was Patrick Henry. And I'm thinking of him on the, when they're trying to get the Declaration of Independence and he gets on one knee, give me liberty or give me death. And then there was, I don't remember, I think it was over ratification, but I'm not entirely sure, where he was an opponent, and Jefferson actually had said to, I believe, Madison, the thing we can do is devoutly pray for his death, because they knew the power of his words to persuade. And that's the sort of the concern in countries where, like ours, where the people have a say, is if you have these effective persuaders, rhetoricians, and they're all over the place. You turn on, I'm scrolling through X, and the way that the people communicate, myself included, although I'm honestly expressing my opinion, I'm not trying to elude anybody or trick anybody, but it's obvious to me that a good amount of what are called influencers are doing just that. They're trying to trick people. So what are the keys to effective rhetoric?
Yeah, this is a great question. And so I want to pause and say the study of rhetoric is not like the study of a science or even a social science, in that it's not very good at predicting. So we don't have scientific models that can predict this particular use of a phrase or something will do the work that you want it to do. So I was talking with a friend of mine, a colleague who also teaches rhetoric, the other day, and we were sort of lamenting that, like, a lot of rhetorical scholars are really good at after the fact saying, oh, this is what worked, this is what didn't work, but we're not very good at predicting and having models that predict. So with that kind of caveat in mind, so the second caveat in mind is, like, it also depends on the system you're in. So what's the kind of communication, what we might call ecology? So there are a lot of communication ecology people that think that the rules or the structures that govern your behavior are part of a system that we are participating in. So X is its own kind of communication system that prescribes certain rules of use and behaviors. And some rhetorical strategies will make sense on X and others will not. So public speaking, for example, like live public speaking, is something we don't do very much anymore. Like, public speaking is a central class in my field. And I was teaching it last semester, and I told my students, I was like, do you guys even do this? Like, should this even be the thing that we're teaching anymore? And, they were like, no, we don't really do this. We do these other things. So what works in public speaking might not work in a different kind of mediated environment. So those are some caveats to keep in mind. Now, in the 2,000-year history of rhetoric, we have come across specific strategies or tactics that tend to work really, really well. So one of them that I think influencers use really, really well is called identification. And the assumption in rhetoric is that we're always identifying and dividing. That's like one of the primal components of language. And I teach my students that, for example, we is perhaps the most powerful word in the English language. because when you can get people to see themselves as part of a we, they have this feeling of identification with someone else in the we. But the we almost always comes against a them or an opponent that's not us. And so this identification division tends to be at the center of a lot of rhetorical processes. One rhetorical theorist went so far as to say identification is persuasion. It's like the foundation of all persuasive communication. So I think we talk a lot in my classes about this kind of process of identification. By what means can I get, and in rhetorical theory, it's called being consubstantial, which means feeling like you share something with someone else, like this feeling of shared oneness that is not given, it's made through communication. So there's like I don't know if you recall, like a long time ago when George Bush ran for president, everybody was saying at the time, oh, Bush seems like a kind of guy I could just have a beer with. And that was part of his persuasive appeal. He was easy to identify with. You could kind of get along with him. So identification tends to be a kind of central strategy in driving persuasive processes. Now, how you do that in language is a trickier phenomenon. There are tactics that you can pick out where influencers are using pretty clearly. There's also tactics by speechwriters. Obama was actually quite good at this. He had a difficult kind of problem of transcending his own race and his own kind of like complicated history. And he managed to rhetorically kind of self-consciously do that, to construct these sort of we, and was very, very good at that. So I'd say the first rule of persuasion is identify, connect with others, construct a we, and you can go pretty far.
That's interesting to me that you said the we, because Donald Trump, for all his failings and whether people like him, don't like him, whatever, he has done a masterful job at getting people to see him as part of a we and us against them.
Exactly.
Which it's really interesting to me because he's a billionaire who was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, and yet he has common people thinking he's like one of them and representing them. So that's very important. And something else that he does, and it's something that I always, it sets my antenna up, that someone's trying to feed me bullshit. When people, if I'm watching a debate or a speech, Obama used to do it a lot of people do it, is they'll elevate their voice. And it comes off as more convincing, or they'll express certainty where there's no business expressing certainty. Like the facts aren't even in yet, but they'll deliver the message in a loud voice with vehemence, with an air of certainty. And I remember I had a friend of mine, and there was a guy who always talked like that. Like he would raise his voice, yeah. And he said, wow, man, that guy's so convincing. And I said, why? Why? He's not making a strong argument. He's basically going into your primary processing.
Okay, I can explain why.
He's connecting to your emotions without you actually engaging the argument he's making.
Well, sort of. Okay, so you're on when I teach a course in persuasion, we have a second law. This is our second law of persuasion, what you're describing right now. There's a lot in what you're describing. So what we say in persuasion class is emotions always bias reasoning. So what I said before, communication is a process of producing effects on someone else. So tone of voice, for example, is enormously affective. So regardless of the words, the tone produces an effect. So if you start a conversation with your partner with a tone of resentment, it's not going to go well. It doesn't matter the conversation. The tone of resentment will color the reception of the message or the argument. So the same thing is happening with this guy, tone is being used to activate an emotional response, and those emotional responses are biasing the reasoning of the person afterward. So philosophers like to think you can get rid of all that. You can just exist in a kind of university seminar room where we just evaluate the quality of the argument. Rhetoricians don't believe that. Like, I don't believe that's a human possibility. I think our emotions are always biasing our reasoning. And good persuaders are kind of aware of that and can use it. I think that requires good audiences to also be aware of it, to know when our emotions are kind of like driving us to respond in particular ways. Aristotle went so far as to say, like, one of the purposes of a public speaker is to put the audience in the right frame of mind. And what he meant was, his rhetoric is really a treatise on psychology. It's like, if I want you to go to war, how do I make you angry at our opponent? Like, I have to put you in the emotional space to want to follow the argument, essentially. So that's what you're describing, and it is foundational component of strategic persuasion. It just is. Like, we can't avoid those emotional reactions.
See, here's where I would disagree with teachers of rhetoric, because while I agree that emotions play a large part, not only in my individual life, but especially in groups and trying to convince people, and most people are certainly given to being caught up in emotional appeals. But you offered a conclusion there, a proposition, right? You said all our conclusions are biased by emotion, all our reasons biased by emotions. But that itself is a conclusion. And if your reasoning is automatically biased, then your reason wouldn't be able to accurately come to that conclusion. So it ends up, it's just self-negating.
Yeah, I hear. So my response to that would be, well, if you were a clever psychoanalyst, you could unpack my historical educational circumstances that might allow for a story about like why I come to that conclusion. And that story would likely involve some kind of emotional predisposition that had its origins in some moments, right? Like I entertain that as a possibility for my own conclusion, certainly. But I also kind of feel like there's not much I can do about it. Like one of my teachers was Richard Rorty, who like famously used to shrug sometimes when someone made a good argument, and they're like, good argument, yeah. And maybe I'm stuck in my own emotional trap, but so are all of us. And I think rhetoricians need to strategically kind of work through that or respond to it.
I'm going to ask one more question about this, only because this is a vital part of my own worldview and the audience that listens to the show. It's reminiscent to me of Immanuel Kant, right? Immanuel Kant says we can only know the phenomenal world, that our minds are made up of these categories that process the information without us knowing and present us with a world that doesn't actually exist, right? The problem is Kant is making a claim about what the noumenal self does, what the real self does, which he at the same time says we can never know. And for a rhetorician to say that he knows that we're all trapped in this bubble where we can only, we're heavily influenced by our emotions, he's making a knowledge claim that in and of itself would have to be biased by his emotions. Yeah. Something which, if you accept his theory, he could not know.
Yeah.
Or she. I don't want to come off as a sexist.
Yeah. I guess, like, I think I think you're kind of digging at a core difference between a rhetorical approach to the world and a philosophical approach to the world. Right? Like, so I'm less interested in what I know and more interested in what I can do. So I'm also very interested in, for me, what I can do with the argument that emotions bias reasoning. And I feel like I can do a lot with that, even though it might not be an exact, truthful representation of the world. It opens up possibilities for action in the world that I'm interested in. And I can kind of make things work with that proposition that I can't make if I'm overly focused on the epistemological. I don't know if that makes sense. Like, I started out in philosophy and then like switched because I just didn't want to get bogged down with the epistemological kind of question. I was more interested in practical questions. And I think rhetoric as a field is too. So you can do a lot once you realize, oh, this person's emotionally reacting to me. and their emotions are biasing how they're going to reason about something. And I'll also say that, like, a lot of my colleagues, and me included, we studied what's called deliberation. And deliberation is the use of reason for making good decisions, right? But we say part of that process has to involve diminishing the emotional reactiveness of the people involved in the deliberation. Like, you can't reach a good decision. And here I'm going to make an epistemological claim. You're probably not going to like it, right? Deliberation people will tell you, you can't reach a good decision in a collective group setting if people are too emotionally reactive, because they're unable to weigh the evidence and kind of like consider alternative viewpoints and incorporate data, et cetera. So the scientific method, for example, is a method of trying to diminish kind of emotional reactivity in a process of decision making and making claims about the world. That's good, but it takes work, and that's what I'm trying to do with the like, emotions always biased reason. I'm trying to do the work of like pushing us more into the deliberative space.
It's interesting to me that you say you're less interested in the epistemological questions, because one of the reasons that I'm so interested lately, especially in this topic of rhetoric, of communication, is because I think that we're really in an epistemological crisis, right? People pick their own sources of information. You can't get into a debate really, because everyone just says, well, here's my source, and they go to the source that tells them what they want to hear. And the need for an effective epistemology, or an accurate epistemology, seems to me that's vital here. I mean, we just had this, as we're doing this interview, the attack in New Orleans, and then there was the separate explosion of the truck out in Las Vegas. The investigation isn't even done, and I see influencers on the web talking about basically, you can't tell me there's no connection here. I know this seems like the government's behind it. They're making truth claims about things they could not possibly know, right? Or you have the conspiracy theorists who believe that, for instance, the moon landing, that all these countries who were competing with us, the Soviet Union was competing with us, they wouldn't have known. And they don't understand that the amount of people that would have to conspire in such a thing renders it impossible. It's not, human beings just don't operate that way. But in the absence of an effective epistemology and an effective method of critical thinking, you can't have that, and then you become susceptible to the rhetoric of these online influencers, which kind of brings me to my next question, that what is the relation of rhetoric to propaganda? In other words, how are they the same? How do they differ, if they differ at all?
Yeah. So I think of propaganda as a specific form of rhetorical practice. Certainly, it's like a narrow subcategory of rhetoric more broadly. And I think what's going, like, I agree with you, like a lot of what you're describing, I also find to be problematic and troubling, but I would say I don't see it as a problem of epistemology. I see it as a problem of communication systems and the practices that they enable. So, and propaganda is a communication practice enabled by a specific system within which people live. So if I take, for example, if I take X as an example, if you want to get your post viewed, if you want to get your tweet or whatever they're calling it now, viewed and circulate, if you want it to circulate widely, it has to have a specific rhetorical form. And usually that form involves exaggeration and hyperbole. And the Greeks knew the work hyperbole can do, and et cetera. And you can live in a system that doesn't reward hyperbole. You can live in a system that rewards specificity and detail. And maybe that's the scientific method. Maybe it's a different system, whatever. Our current media infrastructure, which lends itself to propaganda as a specific kind of form of rhetoric, comes with a set of rules and recommendations for how to communicate within it. And those rules and recommendations I would say, are not conducive to democracy. They're not conducive to reasoning. They're not conducive to what I would call deliberation, which is like the weighing of evidence carefully to make a good decision. They're conducive to exaggeration, to speed, like moving through the system quickly is a virtue, not slowness, etc. So I'm concerned with the same things. I'm just like wondering how our communication systems promote specific forms of rhetorical practice. And then if you think of propaganda as one specific kind of arm of rhetoric, one specific kind of pathway of rhetoric, and as propaganda as not conducive to democratic life, then, well, are we living in a system where that promotes propaganda, that values it, that circulates it, that gives it attention and money? And I think that's part of the problem. And I don't see us really addressing that problem at all. Like, it's not going away. So you can have more accurate information, but that accurate information is not going to circulate quickly, widely. It's not going to get an audience because in our system, it's not a virtue.
You know, someone asked on X this morning, what were people's thoughts on the two attacks that I mentioned? And my answer was, my approach in these situations is to wait and see what happens. Now, as a podcast host, would-be influencer myself, I know how I could garner attention for myself. I just won't do it. Yeah. I'm not going to sell myself out for that. And the thing is, it's, you know, human behavior is largely driven by incentives, rewards and punishments. And the reward, if you were to get this right, say that you called it, these two guys know each other, they coordinated, they planned this attack, and you turned out to be right, then you get to say, see, I told you. But when these guys are wrong, there's no consequence.
No consequence.
So the reward is high. In the absence of consequence, it just makes the incentive so strong for that. It reminds me of guys that they would be talking about sports, and they every day predicting which team's going to win, and normally are wrong. But then they're right that one time, I told you so.
Yeah.
And you'd say, well, wait a second. What about all the times you were wrong? But that doesn't happen in these spaces.
Yeah. I think it's useful to remember that democracy is slow. It has to be slow. And we live in a world that desires ever more speed. And your instinct, I would call the instinct of a Democrat, of a democratic citizen. Like, let's slow down.
Small d, right?
Yeah. I don't mean a party. No, I don't mean the political party. No, I mean like someone committed to democratic processes, to like thinking through, getting evidence, and making a good decision collectively. But to me, that's just not compatible with the kind of what I might call the architecture of our moment. Like, the demands on you as a podcaster or as an influencer look different than the demands on you as a democratic citizen or a citizen of a democracy. And those two are in conflict right now, like an open conflict. And I don't know necessarily a good way out of that. It's
I don't either.
Yeah, I don't think I guess I would just say to the philosophers listening, I don't think there's an epistemological way out.
What I try to do, and I think I'm effective at it, is understanding that just because somebody disagrees with me doesn't mean they're dishonest and doesn't mean they're a moron.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
We just are disagreeing. So I listen to Sam Harris. I disagree with him all the time, but I never get the sense that he's lying to me or that he's being illogical. He's committed to the same sort of, I want to say platform, because I can't think of a better, ground rules, I think would be a better term, that I am. And that gives a means by which to solve problems. Yep. I used to have debates with a friend of mine. Well, I still do, but not as much because we're not in close proximity anymore. But we would argue about, say, what the meaning of a word was. And then we would get a dictionary, look it up, and then that's over with. Okay, you were wrong, I was right, and we move on. Or, you know, a historical thing, we'd get an almanac and say, okay, you were right, I'm wrong, and we move on. But today, and I've shared this before, a friend, well, not a friend anymore, someone who used to be a friend of me made a claim after the Fox News settlement over the Dominion voting machines. And the guy made a claim that Fox News and Dominion voting machines are both owned by the BlackRock Corporation.
Yeah.
So when he made that claim, I looked it up, I Googled it, in every single site that it led me to said, no, this claim is false. So I told that friend that. And the friend said to me, well, no, he said, the problem is you're looking at Google.
Yeah.
You can't go by Google. You have to go to DuckDuckGo because Google's biased. I said, okay. So I went to DuckDuckGo and the same thing happened, that his information was wrong. So I told him that. But he wouldn't just say, you know what, you're right, I'm wrong. He said, no, you have to dig deeper. And it's just like, well, what, until I find the one guy who says you're right and then that's going to settle it. So we're just not even playing by the same rules of the road at that point.
Yeah, I think, so there's a couple things occur to me in response to that example. Another kind of truism in the history of rhetoric and persuasion in particular is that there's a difference between what you might call push tactics of persuasion and pull tactics of persuasion. A push tactic of persuasion is me telling you, like, I'm going to use a non-political example just to avoid the, like, let's say I'm telling you Michael Jordan is the best basketball player of all time. And you're like, no, it's LeBron. So I'm going to give you all the evidence why it's Jordan. I'm going to try and push them on you. What rhetoricians know is that the more I do that, the more your defensive reasoning will kick in and you'll look for more evidence that LeBron James is the best player. And actually you enter into what's called a cycle of polarization there. So you become more fiercely wedded to your version and I become more fiercely wedded to mine. Push tactics of persuasion only work in specific circumstances. And many of us right now are engaged in conversations where we're trying to push a political belief on someone else and they resist and we're like, and they end up more wedded to the original belief. And that's that cycle of polarization that's happening. Pull tactics of persuasion are different. They start with the assumption that first I need to create a trusting relationship. And the hallmark of a trusting relationship is a person's willingness to express uncertainty about something. So that's actually what you're looking for before you get into, LeBron is the best player. Like I first have to get you to say, I don't know, I'm not an expert in basketball. Like I like LeBron, I like some other, like when you're talking in uncertain ways, that means you're open to changing your belief about something. And then we might explore an actual deliberation about who the best player is. But we don't take time for that anymore especially in our communication environments. There's very little trust between people. That trust is eroded very, very quickly. We're unwilling to express uncertainty or ambiguity about topics. Like if you think about vaccines, anti-vaxxers and pro-vaccine people, they will not express uncertainty. They won't. And if they converse, they're going to be more out of that conversation. There's a lot of data on this. People that study what I study, they go in and they watch these arguments unfold and people get more wedded to the original belief. So there are communication practices you can use to get in that place where someone's like, yeah, I don't know, like maybe, I don't know, I have all the information about Fox. And pull tactics of persuasion tend to be better at belief change than push tactics, especially when it's a strongly held belief or behavior that you're trying to alter.
You know, an example that I frequently give to people that I talk about this sort of thing, and it relates to what you just said about being uncertain. I don't know everything. I can't know everything. Somebody was talking about one day that they don't trust any experts. And I said, well, that's fine. But when my car breaks down, I'm going to go to a mechanic. And if I'm breaking down, I'm going to a doctor.
Yeah.
Right. And there's things in this world I know nothing about. Now, like quantum mechanics, quantum indeterminacy conflicts with my general philosophy of the world, which I'm an objectivist, the philosophy of Ayn Rand. It's Aristotelian, contradictions don't exist. But I don't know enough about quantum indeterminacy. You could show me all the math examples. I wouldn't even know what I was looking at. And I'm okay with that. I don't have to know that. I don't need to, but I'm not going to pretend I know it just to fill a void in my knowledge. If it's important enough to me in my everyday life, I'll go study it and spend 10 years on it. It happens that whether quantum entanglement exists or not, which I think they've proved it does now, but I'm not entirely sure. Yeah. But it's not relevant to me. But that's a simple sentence. I don't know. It seems that, especially amongst the people trying to influence, it's something very rare.
So I like two things I want to say about that. First, I take that the ability to express uncertainty to be a central characteristic of democratic citizenship. In order to participate in democratic life, citizens need to recognize that they don't possess all the knowledge. The Athenians thought that. The original founders of the U.S. System thought that. Like, the Athenians, if you have to go to war, like, they had a system in place to, like, ask the boat builders, how long is it going to take to build? How many planks of wood do you need? Ask the generals what they think. Like, the whole idea of democracy is to leverage the knowledge of the collective for everyone's benefit, and not assume that one person is all-knowing and can make the best decision. Democracies outperform other systems of government because of their ability to leverage multiple kinds of knowledge from multiple places and multiple different citizens. But for that to work, some people have to say, you know what, I don't know how long it takes to build a boat. Like, I don't know what the general thinks about the terrain over there. Like, I'm going to ask some questions, but I do know this, and this is my contribution. So I take that to be a hallmark of democracy. The second thing I want to say is, like, I also think that the ability to express uncertainty is also the starting point for a lot of really good communication. So, and by good communication, I mean the kind of practices that can create trusting relationships, but also constructive problem-solving relationships. So if you and I are, like, tasked together with doing something in the world, the start of our ability to succeed at that collective project is some admission of uncertainty on our part. If neither of us do that, we have this tendency to be locked into these more destructive communication habits that lead to polarization, that lead to motivated reasoning, that lead to cognitive bias. Like, all these kind of problems occur in communication habits that don't occur if we're kind of open to the possibility that we don't know everything. We are in a moment where people don't do that. Like, they just don't do that. Like, my colleagues wouldn't do that in my department. Like, these are well-educated people. Like, my students aren't always willing to do that. Like, I'm just surrounded by people not willing to say, hey, you know what, I'm not sure. And then see where things go from there. And that, to me, is alarming for the state of democracy.
Yeah, I would agree. So how can we protect ourselves? In other words, what are some signs that we can look for to see if somebody is trying to use rhetoric to persuade us? And what are some introspective tools we can use to see if we're coming under the sway of somebody's rhetoric?
Yeah, like, the first thing that comes to mind, and something I teach in, like, every one of my communication classes, is slowing processes down. So if we are highly reactive, odds are good communication will not follow, and somebody is trying to, and here I'll use the word manipulate as a kind of subset of persuasion. Someone's trying to manipulate us toward a particular end. So reactivity is not good. Reflexivity is. So, like, taking a moment to think about what's unfolding in front of you is a really important component for effective communication, slowing processes down and not being overly reactive. That is, my students complain because part of that involves them becoming self-conscious about their own rhetorical choices, their own habits of interaction, and realizing when they're just trying to stir the pot or, like, force someone to get something out of someone. So they become these kind of self-conscious thinkers about their own communication habits, but I actually think that's a good thing in the long run. And to be more specific, like, some of our triggers, I want to return to the word we for a second. I teach my students, whenever they heard the word we, a red light should go off in your head. And you got to ask, who is this we? is this person inviting me into this we, and am I really part of that? Am I not? Like, how has this we been constructed? And do I want to go along with the way that we is being constructed? There are a couple of other kind of versions of that. I don't want to go too far into this. I thought we would talk about it, but like, there are ways of constructing arguments that need to set off alarm bells rhetorically, and other ways that are invitations into deliberation. So we talk about unqualified and qualified arguments in class. An unqualified argument is something like, everyone thinks X. And a qualified argument is something like, well, teenage boys between 16 and 18 who live in Toronto tend to view things like this. The qualified argument is an invitation to a conversation, a deliberation. You can make further qualifications. The unqualified argument is an attempt to cause a reaction that leads to polarization, that leads to more extreme versions of reasoning that are not helpful. So there's smaller things you can look for too, smaller signals besides the we signal that let people know you're being invited into a real conversation versus you're trying to force a reaction on someone. But in general, it's that kind of reactivity. If you find yourself reacting, like that's a sign that you need to slow things down and think through the kind of click whir kind of action reaction cycle that's leading you in a particular direction.
I would add only that in addition to we should watch out for its famous cousin they.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. 100. Yes. True. Yeah.
Okay, Professor, before I let you go, is there anything we missed or we should have covered that we didn't?
Oh, we didn't get to talk about words very much. Rhetoricians love words because of...
Tell us about words.
So one of the Sophists famously said, words can have the same effect as drugs on the body, which is one place I start my classes with. And the Greeks used to bring soothsayers into battle to speak to the wounds of the soldiers because they believed the power of language was so immense that it could alter the healing of a soldier on the battlefield. You should know that rhetoricians think that way about language. They're these kind of magical, powerful devices for producing effects. And like, we don't need to get too far into this, but like, words don't just transmit information between you and me. They also can do these like things, like cause someone to run into war against an opponent, to make someone heal faster, to make someone fall in love, to make someone want to climb a mountain. They have these powerful kind of affective ability. So mastering that, and even knowing ourselves, which words really deeply affect us and why those words have those big effects on us, is part of the rhetorical project. I describe this to my students as like word choice is the central thing rhetoricians worry about. So if I'm writing an email to like my dean, I'll agonize over the verb of the second sentence because I wanted to do that little magical thing that the soothsayers could do on the battlefield. And rhetoricians really believe that words have that power. And that's a difference with philosophers who are like always interested in the definition of a word. They want to get at they want to know exactly the precise meaning of the word. Rhetoricians want to know how it can be used and like what magical work it's able to do in the world. So we spend a lot of time in my classes on that kind of project too.
What's an example of a powerful word?
Yeah, aside from, in the US, freedom is an enormously powerful word that makes people feel all sorts of things. And a lot of people outside the US don't think Americans are terribly free, but Americans think they are. And it's alarming sometimes. Like I'm American, but I live in Canada now, so I go back often. And the appeals to freedom that are like inundate your kind of media sphere can be overwhelming because marketers know the work that it does. The Republican Party knows the work that it does. So that's one of those like magical words that have a very powerful effect in that cultural context, at least. Different
people mean
contexts
very different things when you use it.
Yeah, these words are not easy to pin down. And that's one of the reasons they have this powerful affective ability, because they're not strictly denotative in a kind of clear, direct sense. They're a little bit more ambiguous, so they can do more affective work, I think.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for being with us today. Where
Thanks,
can
Ren.
people find you? Do you have a blog or
my website's rdanish.com. And I have a podcast myself, although I'm not these days, called Now We're Talking, where we talk about communication practice, like effective communication practices and all sorts of scenarios.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. Please share your comments with us. Give us your likes, maybe even your dislikes, but I hope not. Till next time.